Welcome to devMode.fm, a podcast dedicated to the tools, techniques, and technologies used in modern web development. I'm Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107.
I'm Patrick Harrington from Mildly Geeky in Boston.
And I'm Matt Stein from Working Concept in Austin.
And today we'll be talking to Adam Bradley and Manu Martinez-Almeida from
that was a good one.
Yeah, you did good. That was good.
Good one.
Both from Ionic. So Adam is the director of open source development at Ionic, and Manu is the software engineer, core contributor, and chief approver. So gentlemen, welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having us. This is fun.
Yeah, no worries. And we wanted to have you on because we wanted to talk about web components and where this thing called Stencil fits into the mix and that. So if you two were hiking up the Incan Trail, trying to get up to the Machu Picchu, you know, you've had your mate coca and you're all ready to go to climb up there. If you're hiking up that Incan Trail and one of the guides turns to you and says, hey, you know, what are these web components anyway? How would you answer them?
What are the web components anyways? I'd probably pretty dismiss it and just be like, it's just a way to build web pages.
Yeah,
is that a good answer?
Man?
I have this question. My mother asked me questions like that, what I do, and I just try to simplify it too much. So I don't actually explain what I do. Like, I think no one understands what I do.
It just, the people are familiar with web pages. They see squares on their computer, and like it's part of that stuff, part of the squares that you see on your web page.
Explain
And
with
then
So it'd be a quiet ascent.
someone else who is hiking up the trail with you up to Machu Picchu says, I'm a web developer. I've heard of web components. Tell me what they are. What would you say to them?
Geez, tell me what they are. It's a way to scale your components across many different web pages easily.
No, I will ask you if he's a React developer first.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So that's what I wanted to get to. So I'm familiar with what a React component is, right? I'm familiar with what a Vue single file component is. I'm familiar with what Svelte components are. Aren't they web components? What's the difference? Like, someone clear this up for me. What are they?
So I see it's a different way in the sense that it's not a new component model. Instead, it's a way of extending the component model that we have been using for the last 20 years. It's just a way to create your own HTML components. So the difference means that any framework or any code that ever wrote using JavaScript, it actually uses the web components APIs already. It uses the document create element. So when you use a web component, you are using a technology that it's even back compatible with everything else. So I guess that's the main difference.
So even if I didn't know it, I've been using this API to one extent or another?
I think so, yeah, because when you use the React API or the Angular APIs, you have to use the custom APIs for create a component. Like you use React create element, and in Angular you use something else. But the way to instantiate a web component is not anything new. It's just the document dot create element, and that's the magic about it.
Yep. Yeah, and to be clear, like we're actually, I'm actually a big fan of frameworks. Like we use Angular quite a bit. We're now using quite a bit of React and Vue actually. So I'm a fan of all of them, and I think that they're great, that they're innovating a lot, and it's a great way to build like an enclosed application that works on its own. And I think of it as kind of a shell. It's everything within that shell works great. It's highly tested. The components communicate well with each other. And so if that's your use case, I think frameworks are absolutely a great choice for that. Where Stencil comes in is that we actually want to work on all of them. And we have this use case for Ionic. Ionic is a UI mobile library that we want to work in Angular and React and Vue and anything else. And so that's why Stencil was initially created, was that we want to solve that problem. So not everyone has the same issue or use case that we do, but that's kind of the intent or their driving reason of why we created Stencil.
So Stencil is a tool that can be used to create generic web components, but those can also be used by these other frameworks. Is that what you're saying?
Yep, absolutely. I think the the fun part about Stencil is that we really, it's like to be called a framework, which it's not whatsoever. It's really the tooling around the common component model. So the web components, custom elements, they're low level on purpose. You can read about them in the MDM docs. However, there's no real tooling around them, right? There's no hot module reloading. There's no way to correctly do imports, things like that. So a lot of this stuff isn't provided that you're used to as a framework developer. However, because it's a low level API, which is a great thing, that means that actually all frameworks are using the same component model. And so we kind of wanted to piggyback off that. It's like, we don't want to provide a framework, but we want to provide the tooling that you're familiar with. And to really get to the point of creating Ionic components that are completely dumb to any framework and can be used just no different than how a div could be used.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's not also about the authoring of the components, but also the developer experience when people consume these components. And the key thing is that when you have a React library components, everything works like a React developer will expect. You import a components in this way, and you have the documentation and all this random tooling like pre-rendering, everything works, right? And when you use web components, this kind of things doesn't really work. And Stencil tries to solve these problems as well.
Yeah, that's something I didn't understand, Manu. So like I've been looking at this and I've been trying to figure out like what the hell is Stencil actually doing, because I looked at web components and I'm just like, oh, well, that's kind of neat, but I don't know when I would use this. Like I don't know when I would use a regular web component over building it in Vue or React. Like when would I do that? And then you're saying that if I we'll get back to that question, right? So we'll figure out later on like why we might want to make our own native web components. But if I decide that I want to make native web components, you're saying that Stencil is kind of filling in the gaps and making it a better experience for me that I want to do that?
Yeah, exactly. And for the people that is going to use those components. Because, when we decide to create Ionic Angular 4, the latest version of Ionic, we know that the first thing we know is that the ecosystem is very different today, and there are many frameworks. So that was important for us to say, we want to provide this common collection of components, and we want everyone to be able to use them, right? That's one of the things. But the second thing is that we want those developers using those frameworks to feel like home. We want them to feel like they are still using an Angular collection of components or a React collection of components.
Yeah, because when it really comes down to it, as a React developer, you're accustomed to importing the component you want. It's going to have, it's going to be Pascal case. You're going to add into your JSX. That's just how a React developer operates, and that's what they know. So we don't want to change anything there. And the same thing for Angular developer. They use ng module. They're able to use HTML templates, things like that. And so we want to keep everything identical to what they're familiar with. But at the same time, we're a small team. We put a lot of time into our components. We shouldn't have to rewrite them every single time for every single framework. When in reality, they're still just divs with CSS and the same JavaScript. So that's why we were able to start. The core of our components really are just seen an ES6 class with some CSS. They can stay pretty dumb. I mean, they don't have to be tied to a framework at all. But then from there, because they're so low level, we're able to, scale those to work inside of React, Vue, Angular, and anything else. And even a little bit more history behind this is that in 2013, 2014 is when we came up with Ionic 1, and that was built on AngularJS, which was the first version. And that was great. It was
what is that? What is that? Explain to people what that is. I think a lot of people have no idea what that is.
Ionic or AngularJS?
Ionic 1.
Ionic 1. And so that was our first version of our UI library to build mobile applications using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then you're able to use something like Cordova, which is a way to deploy your app inside of that Play Store or inside of the App Store. So basically, you're using your web skills to build native applications to deploy into the native stores that users can download. And it worked really well. It was great. We put a lot of time and effort into our components. The problem was end of 2014, 2015 is that Angular then decided to rewrite everything from scratch. They gave it the same framework name, but it's an entirely different framework.
Right.
And so what that meant to us is that we needed to rewrite everything from scratch, all of our components, all that hard work, all the documentation, everything needed to be redone just to create basically the same components.
So you were real happy about this, right?
Yeah, we were thrilled. It was a lot of fun. To Angular's credit, they've been great for us. We actually have a really good relationship with them. We work with them especially when we were building Ionic, we worked with them on a weekly basis. So kudos to the Angular team for helping us out in a lot of it, but it was a lot of work. And so we came up with Ionic 2. Ionic 2 was the one built on on Angular 2, and then Ionic 3 was the same thing, had some more improvements off of Angular 2. But then, we saw more of like Angular IVs coming out. And throughout this entire process, we had so many people ask us, what about React? What about Vue? And it's like, well, we'd love to do that. I was like, yeah, we can. And you look into it and you're like, wow, this is, we already can't maintain one framework, let alone now we have to have 3.
Right.
And so that's when, and I think almost at exact same time is when Safari had announced, I think 2017, the summer, that they had come out with web or custom elements in Shadow DOM. And we traditionally have always worked on just Safari and Chrome because, we're for iOS and Android. So when we saw that custom elements version 1 was, a full spec, there was no polyfills required and everything could run native, that's when we kind of questioned everything. It was just like, wait a second, we could actually build our components to be just stupid ES6 classes with JavaScript, not tied to anything. And then we can scale those to each of the different frameworks.
So it sounds like Stencil is something that was built out of your own internal need, in that you were in a unique position as a developer developing this UI library that you wanted to be able to have it work with a whole bunch of different frameworks.
Absolutely,
so you wanted,
100%. Yeah.
So you wanted to be able to make agnostic components. But I think that kind of makes sense in a lot of situations, because I may be using React now on this particular project, but it'd be real nice if the components that I designed, if I ended up switching frameworks somewhere down the road, could kind of come along with me. Is that something that Stencil can help out with?
Yes. I mean, that's exactly the problematic you explained. That's exactly, it's actually one good point for when you implement a design system, right? You implemented your design system because you want something that lasts in time. You don't want to be creating this design system every time that you change framework or you have a new, maybe let's say you have a big company and it scales to many different teams and a new team wants to use Vue, right? So at that point your design system stops being useful, right? So that's exactly what you said. That's exactly a good use case for Stencil. Absolutely.
Yeah, you can't really go back to your designers and be like, nah, it's going to be a lot of work, like we can't do it, Yeah.
And really, I mean, we get a lot of feedback from larger companies, and the number one thing is that you hear about some team in the organization does create a design system, but they built it in React or they built it in Vue or a certain version of Angular, and they build it and it works great and they love it, but then they have a problem of other teams in their organization adopting it, where it's like, well, we're not going to use Angular, we're using React, or we're not using that version of React or something like that. And so that's a common use case of just like, there are design systems out there, but the other teams in your organizations are not able to adapt them easily.
So I can totally get how this would be really useful for, large companies that are doing things, quote unquote, at scale, which is like the new marketing tagline that every software product is apparently doing things at scale, right? But how would a smaller developer, let's say that I primarily do stuff with Vue, is there a way that Stencil could still potentially benefit me?
Yeah, I think definitely it's for much larger organization with lots of different developers, different teams. But that said, Stencil on its own is able to work as its own app, work as its own web components. If you're only building Vue, if you're a single developer and you're not sharing your code with anyone, it probably makes sense to just stick with Vue and not involve Stencil. But if you're building components that you want to share with many people in many different frameworks, or you don't know how it's going to be used, or you don't know if it's going to be used in your framework at all, that's kind of where Stencil would shine.
Or if you are starting an app from scratch. We have, for example, in Ionic, we have our Stencil side, the Ionic docs. Many internal projects are pure Stencil projects. They are not even components to be served, but they are actually the product itself. So Stencil can also do that. It's not that it's only useful for design systems.
And actually, I first heard of Stencil when we had Rich Harris on here, and he mentioned something about Stencil, and I was just like, my God, like another framework that I haven't heard of. This is crazy. And then I researched it and I checked it out. I'm like, oh, this really is something I should have heard of, because a lot of people are apparently using this. And they mention it, and then we've got Matt here, who he's kind of like, he sees the shiny object and he's like, ooh, shiny object, right? So I think Matt went down the rabbit hole of starting to build stuff in Stencil, right, Matt?
Yeah. So I'm on the slow end of the learning scale. I'm just now learning that components are a thing. And I was built to try and learn by comparison. I decided I was going to take all the frameworks I've heard of and then just build like the same simple things in each of those frameworks, just to see how they responded or what it was like to work with them. And what I learned, I was shocked. And I'm commonly shocked to learn things that people already knew about for a long time. But I learned that there's a difference between web components and JavaScript components, and that the browser actually knows what to do with these custom elements. And my impression of Stencil, and you correct me if I'm just hopelessly wrong, is that if I'm building something from scratch, it's lovely to design and build with components. Web components can be really lightweight, and if I don't need the overhead of a framework, Stencil kind of has my back in working with something that's nearly native to the browser and much more pleasant to work with. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a big difference in, like, I definitely like to say over and over again is, like, we're not a framework. We're not trying to be a framework. We're not trying to compete with React. But another reason we can say that we're not a framework is, like, we actually are not providing much JavaScript whatsoever. We're letting the browser and all the native APIs take care of it. Something like Stencil would be really difficult to pull off 10, even 5 years ago. But today, with where browsers are at and all the APIs and all the things that have been learned from other frameworks that are now native to the browser, we're able to provide tiny, tiny components and really just letting our tooling make it easy developer experience. But the framework itself doesn't exist.
Which is super cool and still blows my mind. And for the other slow learners out there, what this means is, like, you already know HTML. You can have a paragraph tag, p tag, div tag, whatever. You can make your own cheese tag if you want to. Right. And the browser will know to some degree what to do with that. And it sounds like Stencil exists to smooth out the gaps in the developer experience and all the things that would otherwise be catches working that way.
Technically, Matt, I think you can't make your cheese tag.
Oh, sorry, cheese maker or
Right. So in order for it to be a web component, it has to have a dash in it, right? So that's my understanding, and I'm not an expert on this at all, but my understanding is that your components have to have a dash in them in order for it to work. And then basically all you do is you just do, like, cheese dash grater, right? And then you've got a tiny little bit of JavaScript that registers your cheese.grater behavior and whatever it's going to do when you use this component. And that's it, right? Is that right?
Yeah. Perfect analogy. And being that it was developed in Wisconsin, that makes a lot of sense.
I hear a really interesting use case. I think it was someone that was trying to explain HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to just students that didn't know anything about the web. And the cool thing is that they could just create an empty index HTML and not have to install package.json or npm or Node or anything, and then just include the script tag to include Ionic and use that. And I think, and
whoa, hold on, Manu, hold on. Are you telling me that you in 2019 you can have a web page without a 2 megabyte JavaScript bundle and it will work?
Crazy, right?
I know. Wow. It's mind blowing, isn't it?
But it's it's stupid, but it's not trivial, right? If you try to build any complex application right now without all that tooling, it's actually complicated, right? And
right.
Just with web components, you can just drop this web component, and it might bring a lot of functionality to your app without doing anything, and that's very interesting.
Yeah, and I think you guys definitely hit the nail on the head. Like, the big unsung hero, in my opinion, is custom elements. But the fact that JavaScript runs when it hits the DOM, when connected callback is executable code, it runs when something happens. That's the big reason why Stencil is possible, is connected callback. Without that, we have to build a whole framework to know when something was connected. We have to have our own shell, be able to communicate. But now that the browser is able to tell us, like, oh, hey, this thing is existed, or this attribute change, it's able to tell us everything now. And so we don't need to provide a framework.
Yeah, you can just tap into it. You get essentially an event or whatever when something is registered, and you can do your thing. Is that how it works, kind of?
Yep. Exactly. And we also are very, very strict to ensure that we don't invent a new way to do communication or be able to pass data or anything like that. It's purely set attribute, getters and setters on objects, custom event for emitting events. But that's it. I mean, we don't want to have a synthetic event system or anything like that.
I'm still a little fuzzy on a couple of things, but I want to give Patrick a chance to jump in here. If Patrick, are you fuzzy on anything?
I don't know if I'm fuzzy. I was a little bit apprehensive coming in. I remember when web components, the first time I was aware of them was maybe 4 years ago when Google had their Polymer project, and they were kind of trying to bring web components, but there's a lot of overhead, and it seemed like all the demos, everything ended up looking like a Google Android app or something. So I don't know. To me, like, I was like, oh, web components, those things came, they went, no one cares. We're all onto React and Vue and all that.
Yeah, it kind of feels like they died a few years ago, or at least that's, I know that's wrong, but I think that's a perception a lot of people have, right?
Yeah, and I didn't even realize that, support with browsers had still been building for them. Yeah, I don't know. I think a lot that just clicked with me while we've been speaking is the idea that, it can be amazing to build components in React, to build them in Vue, but they're very much tied to those frameworks. With this, you can build something that is standards-based, space that isn't relying on an outside library just to render in the DOM, that uses good old HTML, CSS, JavaScript without any other backing. And it can then move between those. I'm really interested just looking at the documentation of how right now we're doing a lot around Vue single file components and work that we're doing. And the idea that we could build those and not have them be like forever tied to Vue is pretty compelling.
Yeah. Well, let me ask a couple of questions that I'm fuzzy about then, if you gentlemen don't mind. So the first is why?
Why did you do this?
Why? No, but so if I'm sitting down and I want to start working on something for the web, why would I choose native web components over using a framework like React or Vue? Like what would be in my decision-making tree? Because my understanding is that a recent high-profile web page from Apple is using native web components and was built with Stencil. Is that right?
Oh, right. Yeah, I forgot all about that. Yeah, Apple is a great use case. They are a large organization. They have many teams, but really the core of a lot of stuff they build is in Sprout Core and Ember.js. And their hands are kind of tied that they're not really able to just overnight change that around. Mm-hmm. At the same time, they've got many different, web properties. In their case, they had Apple TV homepage that's able to play videos. They have the Apple Music site that's able to play music and videos, but they're all having to recreate the wheel at each of those sites. And so from what we've seen is that it's a perfect use case in that they're able to build one library that is able to be shared across all their websites, all their different properties that they want to be able to play video and play music with. And Stencil was a perfect use case for that, especially because it's able to lazy load itself. So instead of having to take the penalty of everyone having to download all of this video player code, they only have to download it on demand, and they can set all when stuff gets lazy loaded and when to use it. But that's a huge advantage, is that it's not a part of the critical path unless you want it to be.
I also want to point out that I think it's an unfair comparison between a framework. Like you have to choose between using a framework or web components, because web components, they are really a set of new technology that solves really important problems. And so one of them is encapsulation. Like it actually provides, a really good encapsulation using Sourdough. That solves the problem of having a component inside any page and it actually runs. Like nothing outside breaks the component. So that's one of the things. And the second thing is what I said previously about being able to create your own component, but using the document create element API. So that's really the only two things that the web components technology solve, right? But nothing else. So that's why it's not really that you use web components, but web components is actually a technology that framework can use.
But do they?
They don't. But for example, I think Vue has an output where you can create Vue component, but it actually outputs a web component. And it's just that. It's just a web component, but inside it uses the Vue render. So you can use Vue, but actually when it's going to be used outside, you can just use the create element API, for example.
Yeah, because that seems to make more sense to me. And I think that's the part that I've always had an issue with, or I just haven't understood, is I'm like, well, okay, I could sit down and I could use native web components for this, but then I don't get any of the reactivity that I like. Then I don't get any of the lifecycle stuff. And then I'm just like, okay, well, I guess I won't use web components. But it sounds like if I had used something like Stencil, I mean, I would kind of get this stuff for free if I ended up deciding to want to use it.
I'd say that's definitely kind of where we landed, as we were like, let's use custom elements and Shadow DOM for Ionic. We quickly ran into is like, okay, we've got over 100 different components for both iOS and material design. We've got a distributed team. This is actually a lot of work, and that's where Stencil just kind of naturally grew out of that, of just like, well, let's have it do this. Let's have it be reactive. That one feature in Angular is really, really nice. We should do that, and so that's kind of where it came from. Yeah.
It sounds like if I was considering starting a new project, like Manu said before, that I might consider doing it in Stencil, even if I ultimately was going to use Vue or React or one particular framework with it, just because the overhead of doing it that way is not so much more than just doing it the way I'm used to doing it. Does that sound correct? Well, I guess basically what I meant is if I'm starting a new project, and normally I would do this project in Vue in terms of designing my components, and maybe I'm using Figma, and maybe I've got Storybook, and whatever whatever my design chain is. But I decide instead of just doing it directly in Vue, I'm going to use Stencil. It sounds like it may not be adding a whole lot of time to the development process, but it is giving me a lot of flexibility with these components down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially because, some other team wants to use your stuff and use in React. But something that we really haven't hit on yet is also at the core of all of this would be the compiler, and the fact that we kind of see the source file, the file that you're writing about the component is, again, is just the ES6 class with a render function. We try to keep that as simple as possible. We purposely do not have a bunch of APIs. There's very little that you can import from Stencil core. And that's all on purpose because we don't really want to have an API. And so if we keep those components simple, if we keep them not having all of this crazy custom way to do things in different versions, that means we can continually have the compiler continually growing with, development, adding new features or adding new internal features, being able to speed things up, be able to take advantage of browser APIs. Even in the time that Stencil has been around, we've been able to remove a lot of runtime code in favor of what the browser provides. The biggest one would be async await and dynamic imports. Now, none of that was remotely possible, but now it's entirely possible. And then the next thing is, having differential bundling. So we have, an IE11 with ES5 and system modules that's automatically getting generated for IE11 code. But then all the stuff that IE11 requires is not even remotely in the actual build that would be in for everyone else, for the other 99% of your users. So we're able to go straight to using ES 2017. We're going straight to using dynamic imports, which is awesome because we're not having to rely on Webpack to do any of the dynamic loading. We let the browser decide how to do the requests, how to use HTTP2 together at the same time with multiple requests. So again, we're putting all of the work onto the browser and not your runtime code.
Yeah, and working the compiler. I think some of the things that, most of the work we do in Stencil is writing transforms and ways to improve the generated code. So things like we can do is that we perform a static analysis of how the components depend on each other, so we can optimize them, how we bundle them. We can auto-generate module preload rules in the index HTML, so we can make the critical path to download the critical path, and that's the set of features that the compiler can do because we have a full knowledge of.
Yeah, and the always a silly example is like a Hello World app, right? It's an app that actually doesn't do anything, but everyone wants to see how big the Hello World app is. What I love about ours is that because we analyze everything about that Hello World component, we know what you are and are not using, which is basically you're using nothing other than you're returning the string hello world. The compiler is able to just naturally view all that, see you're doing nothing, and the final output of it, what was the most recent number, Manu? Final output of the hello world app was?
I think it was 133 bytes.
Yeah, uncompressed. And then I think with Bradley, it's like 84 bytes.
It's like a kind of a stupid example, right? But this to-do MVP, I think MVC or MVP?
MVC, yep.
MVC, yeah. Which is this to-do list like everyone tries to implement in every possible framework. So I think it's just 2.4 kilobytes, which is smaller than most Hello Worlds in any other framework.
Well, you're gentle about Hello Worlds. These are the apps I write most often, and I'm very proud of them. So we could be sensitive to that. I would appreciate it.
Well, in the 102 byte Hello World that you're talking about, if you compress that with Brotli, it's probably like -5 bytes or something. Right?
I think it was 84 is what we saw. 84 bytes for a Hello World app.
I'm going to go with -5. I like
which is kind of funny because we really can't take credit for that, right? That's entirely because the browser is doing everything. So it's just, but it speaks to what the compiler is able to understand about the components you're writing.
Okay, but speaking of understand, I still don't understand. Like, how does Stencil work? If does it actually generate like a .vue file? Is that if I'm building this thing and it will build components that work in all of these frameworks, is it generating code or what does it do?
Yeah, so in the end, it's still just generating web components or custom elements, and it knows how to wire up the styles. It knows how to wire up Shadow DOM if you're using it. We do use JSX because that's the one standard that doesn't exist is templating. So there is no templating standard. If there is one, it would have to be JSX because that's probably the most widely used. And that's kind of what we gravitated towards. The day that there's a standard templating syntax, that's the one we'll use. I'll just say that. And then we can even cut out more runtime code. But it doesn't exist. So we use JSX. And yeah, like what it actually generates is dependency-free component. And when I say dependency-free is that like it's not reliant on Stencil at all. For example, like Ionic or even Ionicons, they see millions of downloads per month, but like Ionicons has 0 dependencies. Any of the users of all those millions of users using those components, they're just using a web component. They're not using a Stencil component. They're also not, adding to our Stencil core NPM numbers because no one's getting it, because it was only the core developers of those components that actually have it as a dev dependency, not a dependency. And that's
how does it work with Vue then? Like, what is the work with Vue part? I'm not getting it.
So there is by default, the Stencil just builds web components, but the whole compiler architecture is about something that we call output targets. So for the same build, you can have different output targets. It can be building a docs, which will generate a README for components. So you could have the docs in GitHub. You could generate a website, and some of those bindings actually can be external to other repos. They are bindings, so it will generate bindings for React or bindings for Angular or bindings for Vue. But these bindings, actually, they are not required, right? Like if you try to use a web component in Vue, it will work. The difference is that these bindings usually improve a lot the developer experience, right? When they like React or Angular developer use the component. So that's just another output target when you use a Stencil.
At the core, it's still wired up to the custom element, but because we know which properties exist and what their types are and everything, then that framework's way of wiring up properties, we use their way.
Oh, really? So if I'm doing something in Vue and I'm used to the fact that things can change based on a property changing just reactively without doing anything, that just works?
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. And so like Angular uses, the banana box, syntax where they have those brackets around different properties.
Yeah. Or more complex thing, like you are used to use the Vue DevTools or the, React DevTools, and you expect this, Vue components to be there. That's the same. Or, you expect the IDE to find the docs for the properties, something like that. That will still work.
Yeah. So web components, specifically Vue and Angular, they're gonna just work naturally. But yeah, that's where our output targets take it one step further and really try to improve the experience. And when it really comes down to it, all of our Ionic Angular users, they don't need to know that they're web components because it actually doesn't matter.
Okay. Right? I think I got it now. I think I'm finally getting it. What Stencil really is the glue code between your components and these various frameworks.
Yes. And I will say, like, the one that's a little bit different would have to be React.
Okay.
I think there's a common misconception out there that, web components don't work in React. I think that's kind of a different way of saying that, React made the decision to not make web components work in React. And it's more, for example, Preact works just great. All the many different frameworks that are JSX based and use a VDOM work great with web components.
But I want to point out that under the hood, at some point in the React code base, there is a document create element. And
exactly.
That's my point about, even if React doesn't want to support web components, they do, because they just use the DOM API. So we just have to solve a special case that probably you can explain better. But
and you have solved it, though.
Yeah.
The important part is, everyone out there, you have solved it. So if you do stuff with Stencil, React will work.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that, people say that React doesn't work with web components. It's actually, React's version of JSX purposely does not pass down objects as properties. But that doesn't mean that you can't make them work just fine. And that's what our bindings do, is that, actually, we still have access to that element. That element was still created with document.create element. Everything that we need for it to work is going to be just fine. So we do that extra layer of making sure everything works exactly how you wanted it to work, and avoid, the common scenario of saying React doesn't work with web components, because that's simply not true. So
how far do you go with this? Can I use things like computed properties that I'm used to using in Vue? Can I use those? Yeah,
if you can think about any element that you'd set something to, if it's a div, it's no different than if it's a custom element, right? So however you would have done it in Vue is exactly how it's going to work with the custom element. So you think of the input tag, it's got type and value and all those different things. How you would do that in Vue is how you're going to do that to a custom element, where it's got its own properties and attributes.
Yeah, and if you use TypeScript in React, you will get types and everything as well, exactly the same.
Oh wow! That's really neat. And what about things like, if I'm getting on board with using hooks in React, is that something that, how would that work in Stencil's universe, or would it?
Well, actually, that's also the beauty of it, is it really doesn't matter. This also kind of speaks to why our fears of, Angular constantly changing and moving, and how things are going to work with ng zone, ng modules, things were always, in flux of how it's going to work, which required us to rewrite everything. So we purposely wanted to make sure that we were not involved with that. So as hooks has come out, as Vue 3 is coming out, as all these, Angular Ivy's coming out now, as all these things happen, I just kind of enjoy the show. It has nothing to do with how our components work. I don't have to tell everyone on our team that we now need to refactor our 100 components again because React changed something.
Oh, that's when you did a good job, because back when you had the, you had the Ionic 1 to Ionic 2, you wanted to jump off a bridge. And now when new releases are coming out, you're just like, oh, that's cool. We work, right?
Yeah. It's a lot of fun. And I think Angular 8 and Angular 9 was definitely good validation for us. And we're actually going to be releasing Ionic version 5 soon, which is largely just a design update. So we want to make it look like modern iOS and Android. So there's a couple design updates, which is why we're giving it a version number change. But if you're an Ionic user in the past, going between version 1, 2, 3, and 4 were all pretty significant changes. Going between 4 and 5 is actually just a design. You're going to notice your app looks a little bit different. So you're not having to really rewrite anything at all. And that's, again, I think speaks to us keeping the API pretty simple and purposely not trying to use framework versions or framework APIs.
Now, let's say that I've listened to all this and I said, all right, it sounds like a great idea. I'm going to start using Stencil for all this stuff. And, I'm using web pages with Vue or React or whatever, and I'm designing my components and doing all this stuff. And then at some point, I'm like, you know what? I want to make an iOS app. Will the fact that I've used Stencil help me? And then I can leverage the Ionic framework, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's actually, and that would be up to the use case of what you choose. We actually have quite a few Ionic users that use Stencil only to build their Ionic apps. And then there's quite a few that largely are Angular using Ionic. But that would be the question for the team of what do you prefer? Which framework, if you wanted to use a framework or no framework or just custom elements or just HTML, that's entirely your decision. But Stencil will be able to work for any of those. And that also speaks back to what Manu was talking about, where it is kind of fun to hear about schools and younger developers that are able to just write HTML and quickly have an app in hand of how it's going to work. And so that is all because of, Stencil is able to generate pure web components that don't require a framework. And so the first lesson number 1 is this is an Ion button, and they hit refresh and they see the button that's blue and it's got the text that they wrote right inside there. They didn't have to learn anything about JavaScript yet.
So Manu, if I learn this stuff, if I start using Stencil, it's going to give me a leg up on making an iOS app?
What do you mean when you say iOS app, it's a native iOS app or?
Well, I would assume that I can use the Ionic framework and something else to help me build a native iOS app. Is that incorrect?
Yeah. Yes. And I think one of the, cool approaches of using Ionic is that you are not using the Ionic framework. You are using the web, right? The web technology.
Right.
And the Ionic framework and Stencil helps you to build application faster. For example, one core difference between Ionic approach and the React Native approach is that if you want to use Firebase, for example, you have to find the React Native way of using Firebase or the React Native way of doing anything.
Right.
But there is not this. That's not the case for Ionic, right? It's the web way, and then Ionic is just another thing that solves the UI side. So you will get all the nice animations and all the nice gestures for iOS and material design out of the box. And cool thing is that you can use Vue, you can use React, or you can just have an empty index HTML. But part of this framework idea that we talk about in Ionic is not that it's a framework in the sense that you have to do it in the Ionic way, but more about the tooling around Ionic. The tools that we have to generate the native application, right? Is the tooling we have around Angular, the tooling around React. Is all that tooling why we call it framework?
I've realized that I was thinking about Stencil entirely backwards. So I was viewing Stencil as a way to make native web components. And it's kind of the opposite is my understanding now, because it's more like what enables Stencil to work at all is the fact that native web components are here.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's in all the browsers right now, I think, right?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I was thinking about it totally backwards. I'm like, oh, Stencil is for making native web components, but why am I going to want to do that? It's the opposite. It's the fact that native web components are here allows the Stencil tool to operate, which can then build stuff that can interop with any of these frameworks. So that's really neat.
Exactly.
That's like a light bulb has gone off. Okay.
Yeah. And again, back to the compiler, what I'm excited about is because we keep, the simple API design, we're able to to improve the same components by just improving the compiler. We don't have to keep asking the components to be rewritten every time. It's just, there's this new thing coming out. Let's improve the compiler, and everyone just magically gets these improvements.
And what about the design tool chain? Like, does Stencil integrate with any of these tools, or is it reasonable for it to integrate with, Storybook, Figma, Framer, any of these things?
Yeah, I was going to say, we definitely know of quite a few members in the community are using it with Storybook, and I'm trying to think what else. A lot of it's own self-documenting. Again, because we do static analysis, we're able to understand everything. We're able to build our own docs. Actually, the whole ionicframework.com/docs is all built off of Stencil static analysis.
So to some extent, like a tool like Storybook is maybe less useful because you can just build this stuff out?
I think it's pretty useful. It's something that we would also like to do ourselves to improve upon, and every time you hit save, it's going to magically update. But yeah, it does play well with other tooling too, that we wanted to make sure that we don't want to, or we do want to make sure that Stencil fits the case, because Storybook is a great case of being able to build a design system and share it and show how to use it. So that's an area that's a great partner to work with.
I think also, like within our own company, it splits really well the responsibility. So for example, the team that builds Ionic Core, the set of components, can really focus in building these components a single time, right? And really well. And in the Stencil team, which is Adam and me, we can focus in, for example, writing a new output target for Figma if it's required, or writing a output target for a Storybook. The same way that we have output targets for bindings.
Neat.
So that's what we did with the docs, right? Like, and with other things like stats. One team can focus in building components, and we can solve all the other problems. We can, let's say that Ivy introduces something that we have to change. There is just me that I can make one chain in Stencil, and automatically I fix all the components for all the teams.
I'll tell you, I've been around a long time and I'm pretty jaded, but something that still gets me really jazzed is when I hear about really nice architecture. And I love everything that I'm hearing about the way that you've architected this, so that
we have learning a lot during this time. Like, it was not perfect from the very beginning, but we are getting there.
Definitely a lot of lessons learned. And yeah, that's Manu said it great, where it's nice that the core team working on Ionic components can worry about CSS and components and how the divs work and what the click does. They're not worrying about Vue 3 and Angular Ivy and things like that. And that does help speed up our development.
So is there this sounds like a slam dunk if you're considering building a new project that's going to use web components to start with Stencil. Is there a case where it is absolutely going to be the wrong fit or the wrong starting point for a project where you're building with web components?
Let's see, if you're building like something very, very small, you're a single person, and I guess I would say for smaller cases, it might be overkill. Like if you just have a simple component that just has one button, there could be a case to just write a vanilla web component. And I actually think there's lots of scenarios, maybe more scenarios, where a vanilla web component might be a better option.
All right. Well, you heard it here first. Adam said that single people should not use Ionic. married people is totally fine, but if you're single,
exactly what
stay
I
away
was
from
saying.
Stencil.
But then at the same time, I'm going to switch and play both sides of devil's advocate. It would still be a good habit to get into if you always want to build from it at the same, like just from the perspective of being comfortable with like an always solid way to start, right?
Yeah, especially because you're going to have I think a lot of the development time goes into figuring out how bundling works, how unit tests work, how to get it wired up to TypeScript. So there's so much of the tooling that's such a pain, huge configs to figure out, reading other people's docs, that we try to avoid entirely.
Yeah. What if you're a single prey animal, but you're ambitious, right? And you want to get skills built up to the point where if some company comes along and they're like, well, we've got this whole design system process, and you can be like, whoa, hey, I've got this Stencil thing that I'm really good at, and I've just been doing it on my own because it helps my process personally, but I'm also upskilling in case I would ever get into that situation. I mean, it sounds like a no-brainer to some extent.
Well,
yeah, I appreciate the choir.
I have to say that if you ask me personally, I will always use a Stencil, but I'm biased.
Of course.
Related with
but I know some developers that have worked on a whole bunch of different things that they will not use the thing that they're working on, right? Well, because they know it. So there is some, obviously there is a little bit of nepotism involved that you're going to use the thing that you made, but you are kind of making a statement like, this thing is actually pretty good.
I think one thing that Stencil is always going to be worse than frameworks is that we can't, or we will not innovate too much in the sense of API. So for example, if you want to build forms, very complex forms, then Angular has a lot of tooling and a lot of APIs to make that simpler, right? It has ways for validation, a lot of custom things. And sometimes that simplifies the work a lot, right? Because you can just use this big thing and it simplifies how you build the forms. But that's not something that is going to happen in a Stencil. Like a Stencil core, like the design philosophy of a Stencil core is to try to be really small and match, like the API it has to match one-to-one with web APIs. So sometimes a framework, they have the flexibility to have like higher level APIs, for example, that the Stencil core will not have. So I think that sometimes can make certain things more complicated.
Yeah. And the thing that I'm still fuzzy on, and I'm going to, there's probably nothing either one of you can do about it, unfortunately, is that I know what it's like to sit down and to start building an app in Vue. And I know what it's like to sit down and start building an app in React. I don't know what that experience is like to sit down and start building stuff using Stencil. You know what I mean? Like I just don't have that frame of reference or where do I start or that kind of thing. And
that's fair. And that's something that we really put a lot of time into is to try to make it simple. For example, if just right now you type in npm init Stencil, that entire process, you should be having an Ionic app loaded in the next 30 seconds. So that's something that we're really, pride ourselves on. And like your node modules is only going to be, a couple megabytes versus, 400 or something like that, because you actually doesn't need a lot of those tools. You really just need TypeScript as the one dependency.
Cool. That's actually really interesting because I don't know if you ever try to check node modules ever.
Oh yeah.
You don't even know where that all of that is coming from, right?
Manu, you are a brother from another mother, because I've said the exact same thing. I'm like, you open up the node modules folder and you're like, I don't know what all this crap is.
Well, just create an Stencil app and you will see there is just 2 folders.
Right.
It's crazy.
That's what actually made it weird for me to work with. Is it was I didn't know JSX very well. Like I said, I at least at the time was getting comfortable with JavaScript components, and I had something working a little bit too quickly, and I was suspicious that I missed the point. So good job.
Yeah, I'm a Manu will tell you, I'm just allergic to dependencies. I really do not like a dependency of a dependency. I've gone through way too many horror stories of 3 levels down of dependencies breaks, which breaks this thing, which breaks this thing, and you spend the rest of the week trying to get to work again. So just the less you have, the better. And especially when a lot of them are just utility functions that we can just write ourselves and unit test ourselves, we're able to really drastically simplify Stencil by just writing only what we need and not depending on things that depend on 10 other things.
I think it's also related with our philosophy of being future-proof. I think having a lot of dependencies and being future-proof, they are the opposite.
Sure.
It's always this problem where your app works and then you don't update it for 1 month. You try to run it again and nothing works because during that time something changed, some dependency changed, and nothing works again. So we try really hard to not have any dependency.
The bigger the surface of your app, the more places that it can be hit with a hammer. Right?
Yep.
Patrick, what do you think? Your next app, instead of building it directly in React or, well, hold on. Can we use something like Stencil with Gatsby, or is that just something that would not happen?
That is a great question, actually. Yes. So that's another thing that often comes up when you talk about custom elements, web components, is that they can't be pre-rendered. Well, with Stencil, that's not necessarily true. It goes back to we do have a compiler. We are able to set up and analyze all of your code. Right. We do bundle our own stuff. So because of that, we can bundle our own node-ready application that can pre-render every single one of your components. And so Angular Universal is the first example of that, where Angular Universal has its own way to hydrate the Angular components to be just static HTML and CSS. We're able to take that information and also hydrate all of Ionic's components too. Mm-hmm. which are just web components. And so I think that's a huge advantage that we personally probably don't talk about enough, is that it's able to pre-render, and it's also framework agnostic to pre-rendering.
Well, hold on. So I'm kind of slow.
Yeah,
so
my head hurts.
Tell me, can I use this with Gatsby?
I'm being hesitant on that because I just haven't finished it yet. Yeah. But as in the plugin, it should work just fine. I mean, so like, and I say that it's because the pre-render or the hydrate script is just a function that says, input HTML, output HTML. And so if that input was from Gatsby that had Ion button in it or Ion badge or anything like that, it's able to hydrate that just fine. But I say like it's not ready in Gatsby yet just because I haven't finished the plugin. But the actual core code is exactly what Angular Universal uses already. Right. The other one that I've been looking into is Next.js to make sure that that's going to work. And so, and actually this week we've been playing a lot with Gatsby and Next.js for that exact reason.
And let me put 2 more on your schedule there. Not that you need more work, but also check out Nuxt for Vue, and also check out Gridsome for Vue.
Gridsome, I haven't heard of that one. That's new.
Gridsome is analogous to Gatsby in that it's a higher level, kind of app builder, static renderer thing, and it's for Vue. But basically what you're telling me is that the architecture totally supports this, but you can't say 100% that it works because you're still writing the plugin that is going to implement it, but you see no reason why the earth is not round.
Yeah, exactly. The earth is not round. But yeah, that's it's very similar to what we're doing on the client side in the browser, is that the component itself doesn't matter who actually starts it, creates it, whether it was Vue or Angular. Same thing with the pre-rendering thing. If it was Angular's Universal or Next.js, however that HTML got started, Stencil is able to take over from there.
And do you want to announce anything, Adam, like a release date on this thing? Put some pressure on yourself. The podcast doesn't come out.
I have definitely learned to never do that.
The podcast doesn't come out for a month.
Okay.
Do you want to tell everyone? You want to tell everyone that it's done?
No. I will say the hard part's done. I mean, like it's the plugins for different things that it's just hard to complete. We do actually, on that note, we do have an awesome community. So we have a lot of people inside of the Stencil Slack. So if you go to stenciljs.com, sign up for Stencil Slack. Feel free to ping us about this stuff, because there actually is quite a few people that are working on this to help me out getting the different plugins working. So if you're interested in it, ping us there.
Really cool. Hey, Patrick, you got anything you want to jump in there? I understand what's going on.
Yeah, I do
way
too.
Better than I did going into
it. Oh my gosh, yeah. No, I was like, oh, this is one of Andrew's pie in the sky. This is pretty cool though. Yeah, the idea of making components that are really interchangeable between frameworks just resonates with me. So no, this is cool.
Yeah,
cool. Thanks.
Adam and Manu, he's making fun of me because, I'll have people on to talk about like WebAssembly or other things. And he's just like, no. And he'll be like, no one cares about it but you. I'm like, no, man.
But I feel like the developers we that are listening to the show, they don't want to be just totally tied to a framework and want their skills to be portable. And yeah, this makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And that's the challenge with this Stencil, is just like, don't use a framework, use Stencil. It's like, well, you just said not to. So it gets very confusing, right? Like, so we're aware of that. So we definitely want to make sure that, it's seen as a tool, seen as something like Webpack or Rollup versus something like React or Angular.
I think and also some years ago, Adam and I realized that we don't longer care about which is the most popular framework.
Right.
The developers are always thinking, oh, I want my framework to be the most popular one, because at the end of the day, it's like investment, right? If you spend all this time building the components and the framework, no one is using your framework anymore. You are fucked pretty much, right? But we just realized that we are not in that game anymore. And it's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, and that totally makes sense, in terms of, I think the reason why some developers want their framework to be, the most popular or whatever, is just they don't feel like relearning stuff, They're like, I've already invested all this time in this. I don't want to learn anything more, And I get that, I understand that, but I think tools that allow us to keep things as portable as possible, I think are really useful,
Yeah, I just realized I just finished rebuilding my website in a way that was deeply uncomfortable. And this is a new opportunity to do it again with the promise
there you go.
of doing it fewer times because I've done it in a better way.
And actually, if you look at stenciljs.com, if you view the source of that, that's all a pre-rendered site. And so
good.
The entire site is able to pre-render in 1.2 seconds. So I'm pretty proud of that too.
That's
so
cool.
the performance is pretty good.
eating your own dog food is fantastic. And Matt is talking about he just transitioned his entire website to be rendered on the front end in Twig and Craft CMS to having Craft CMS as a headless CMS and using GraphQL and Gatsby to drive the back end is, what he's got doing. So now he's got a reprieve though. I mean, Matt, you can wait until Adam has finished the plugin.
No, what I'm hearing is I need to get started now. And then I'll be able to use version 2 of his plugin.
Help me build it.
Oh no.
Oh,
yeah.
Matt,
I don't know if you want my help building it, but that sounds fun.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know if you want that. Adam.
Yeah, you'd regret that offer.
All right. Well, this has been really cool, but I think that about wraps it up for another episode of the devMode.fm podcast. If you'd like to have every episode delivered to your favorite podcast player, you can subscribe via RSS or find us on iTunes or Google Play. And if you like what we're doing, please review our show on iTunes. It's the best way to help others find the show. You can follow us on Twitter at devModeFM, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. Leave us a comment on the devMode.fm website where we can continue the conversation. For the devMode.fm podcast, I'm Andrew Welch.
I'm Patrick Harrington.
And I'm Matt Stein.
And I want to thank Adam and Manu for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Gentlemen, I'm hungry now. I want some tapas. I want some beer.
And
I want to head over to Manu's place over in Spain. You know what? I would like a siesta too. I would like all of these things. I want to do the beer and the tapas, and then I want a siesta.
That's right.